Well, a very good afternoon to everybody. For us, this is a celebration because it's the third day of the strategic engagement with Amakosi, and it has been a resounding success. Obviously, we started on Monday, and on Monday, although there were slight hiccups, but the beautiful thing is that in the afternoon, delegates on their own came back. We resumed the business of the day because Amakosi had areas of concern. That was the first time Amakosi had the opportunity to interact with the Ngonyama Transport. Nobody even coerced them. They came back voluntarily to address matters that concern them as Amakosi in various areas. So for us, it was a success, and yesterday was a cherry on top. It was a very productive day with information sharing, particularly from the side of Ingonyama Transport, because we were sharing information that they had never been privy to, except what they've been reading about. And obviously, there is a big difference between interacting with authentic information, posing questions. I unashamedly say it was a very, very successful day. Never mind how we actually started the day on Monday. The rest, right up to now, as we are giving this briefing, it is a celebration. And the challenge we are facing is that coming from the commissions, there is work to do. We will just have to take a little bit of a break and start planning to implement what can be done immediately because there are immediate interventions, there are uh, interventions that will be planned for, and then obviously long term. But what's going to be important for us to do is to address what I would describe as low hanging fruits. There are certain matters that we can implement as soon as possible after taking a break and to plan how 2026 is going to start so that this workshop doesn't just become a talk shop. There must be results coming out of these deliberations. So I know that our acting CEO did a lot of heavy lifting yesterday, and that is why I am also going to be inviting him just to share his perspective, and then we can take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, it was a successful event. We assessed that because we had some predetermined objectives when we set out to initiate this engagement. The rationale behind it is because for almost 3 decades now, Ingonyama Trust Board and Ingonyama Trust has had a mandate that it carries, which is quite vast and wide. We view this mandate to be socio-economic and we view it to be a developmental mandate, which requires everyone to understand what the various roles that need to be played in this particular model of Ingonyama Trust. Not only is it the roles that are important, the understanding of the model itself is fundamental to the work that we do. Once we know the role players, it becomes important for us to understand their functions, their powers, and their responsibilities so that we don't end up encroaching on other people's responsibilities within the very same value chain. Now, if you are going to intend to do this work in honesty and in truth, as it is written in the founding legislation that created Ingonyama Trust Board and expressed what the need of Ingonyama Trust Board and what the powers and the role of the Ingonyama Trust Board were. If you're going to take that on and do it honestly, you need to start by informing people and realigning or aligning the understanding of what Ingonyama Trust is. You need to define what those roles are, and you need to have a conversation with regards to the capacity to actually take on those roles and implement. We find that in trying to implement this model, the board is faced with serious bottleneck challenges because information is not flowing in a logical way as we would expect. Because we sit at a professional level and we assess these things and we have the technical know-how and the capacity to assess, our assessment has brought us here today. So that little prelude was to give a general idea of why the Ingonyama Trust Board made a decision to actually call Imkhandlu Amakosi, which are traditional authorities that are led by Amakosi Zizwe and Izinduna, which are appointed by Amakosi, to have this conversation so that we can determine what the next steps become in implementing this model. Because if it does not work for the people, we're very likely to find ourselves in a revolt position where we are unable to manage these communities. So it becomes quite important for everyone involved, from the community itself all the way to community leadership structures, which as it stands are traditional leadership structures, all the way to us who are administrators sitting in these various capacities, including the Secretariat, including the board, including His Majesty himself, need to find coherent ways of working to ensure that the people of these communities, the people of the tribes of KwaZulu, don't get affected by things that should not concern them. Ours was to ensure that the work begins, and we have done that quite successfully. The term that gets coined is turbulence, that I'm going to make reference to. Now, if you fear turbulence, that means you are very likely to be restricted in flying. And what we view this as, it was the same expression that we used in portfolio committee, that we are flying a broken aeroplane that we have to fix while it is in the air, moving. And so we expect a couple of drops in pressure. We expect a couple of turbulent times. We also expect a couple of times where the pilots and the various stewardesses could be confused in the process. This is why it is very important for us to call all of those, from the manufacturer of the engine all the way to the passengers of the aeroplane, to understand exactly what this journey is about, so that if there is turbulence, we get disturbed and dysregulated for that moment, but because we have learned, we are quickly able to come back and re-regulate ourselves and continue with the work that is going on. We are quite clear that these disturbances are going to be persistent. They are pervasive and they are going to continue. What we have done is develop mechanisms that actually, if not deter, deal with the risk of them materializing to a point of disruption. One of the things that were to materialize was the disruption of this particular event, which would have subsequently then meant that Amakosi neinduna nemkhandlu yonke don't get the necessary information that they got. We saw it as an opportunistic tendency for these things to be done in a way that creates confusion and arouses emotions in the audience. Luckily, some of the background work that we have done, the board has done a lot of legwork to ensure that the ground is fertile for conversations. Luckily, that work has finally paid off. Our various relationships with various powerful stakeholders, like the Portfolio Committee on Land and Rural Development and Land Reform, have made it quite clear that they want to formulate special relationships with the Ingonyama Trust Board because they sit at a purview or at a level where they can have a view that none of us could have at these small little nuanced levels that we sit in. As a result of those relationships, we are able to shock absorb a lot of the disruptions that happen, which protect the working of the model. That too is quite important so that we understand the intention behind the board's plans in terms of doing this work. Now, coming back to what has materialized, at the end of these sessions, or at the end of our entire session, because it has ended now while we're having this press briefing, we have managed to break the conversation down into commissions. We focused on 4 main areas in conversations. These were the main areas that were disrupted on day 1 that were meant to talk to the actual technical framework that governs these areas in doing work. Land administration, land management and strategic land use was commission number 2. Intergovernmental relations was commission number 3. And general governance, including financial matters, was the fourth commission. Our conversation on day one was to bring to Izizwe a report from the board over the past 3 decades of what has actually happened, and then quickly dive into these technical conversations that will unearth some of the challenges that happen within these four critical pillars under which we operate in. We had proposed that on the second day, that must be broken down into these various commissions, where we have heard on the first day the frameworks that govern these particular areas. We would then subsequently go discuss what the challenges in those frameworks implementation and what the challenges with the day-to-day operations of traditional councils in line with these frameworks were, so that Ingonyama Trust can do what it is mandated to do, which is to administer and coordinate the workings of Imkhandlu Amakosi. Now, that conversation would have helped us. The intention was it must help us develop proposed frameworks, proposed policies that then start guiding implementation of these beautiful, brilliant ideas that we have after considering exactly what the legal frameworks is. Ours is quite simple. If Amakosi, Asendlunkulu are no longer happy with certain frameworks that exist that are within the constitutional framework, we exist to create a platform for them to express those views. Those views can only come from implementation of actual work. So we are putting through to Amakosi that they have to learn how to comply with the current framework of set of rules that exist. We then have woken up to realize that we have to create a platform where these rules can be discussed and where change is warranted. We process change through the various frameworks, legal frameworks that allow the changes of laws in this particular country. Now, if Amakosi don't have that kind of information and they don't have that kind of support, you have material outcomes that reflect the current landscape that we have in Ingonyama Trust land. And that is reflected by misuse of land allocation practices that are fragmented and are different from Isizwe to Isizwe. Amakosi today raised that in the commissions and said they want a standardized mechanism of how Izizwe actually operate in terms of day-to-day operations that also impact and affect land. We looked into governmental relations that have to do with land and the role that municipalities have to play. What the disturbances on Monday materialized to was all of the stakeholders that we had invited to allow adequate adjudication of this conversation suddenly had to either leave or were quite unsure of what was happening as we were being disrupted. So we had invited district municipal managers, and we had invited directors of planning in these various districts in KwaZulu-Natal. Because the traditional prime minister, who also holds the role of the MEC, the member of the Executive Committee for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs in KwaZulu-Natal, expressed the expression that was made and even communicated on behalf of the Minister of Land Reform and Rural Development that officials of the department that have nothing to do with executive authority or executive powers or in the administration must be recalled. So that damaged or caused some damage to our interaction and our event, because we had intended for all role players to be present while we have this conversation, because it is true that Ingonyama Trust does not have competence when it comes to issues of integrated development planning, when it comes to issues that are closer to municipalities in terms of mandate. Ours is to coordinate the stakeholders so that we ensure that what Amakosi's wishes are actually executed on the ground with regards to Izizwe, but more so that we execute the mandate of Ingonyama Trust and Ingonyama Trust Board, which is to administer the land and the trust for the benefit, material welfare, and social well-being of the communities, Izizwe, that live on this land. So as much as we then did not have the full complement, because some participants would have left, a lot of them did stay, we were then set back because these conversations could not be held completely and in full. Some of my colleagues that work in the local government space were available to give me personal advice with regards to these matters and were quite clear that because the directive has come out, that they can stay and hang around, but they're unable to express their views and their opinions. So we really, in all earnestness, do view these things as disruptions that stop this work dead on its tracks. But we are clever enough now to understand that these are exactly that, just distractions. So we have to charge forward and move. Some of the issues that Amakosi are mentioning that we are going to start dealing with, that we also got affected by Minister recalling departmental officials. There is a big grievance with regards to community CPAs. There is a big grievance with regards to state land that is neighboring Izizwe Amakosi that belongs to the state. There is a big grievance that Amakosi have with regards to forests that are not financially paying into either Ingonyama Trust or Izizwe are not benefiting from those. All of those conversations came up and we have reduced them into writing. And what we will do is we will have to draw on the side the various players that need to respond to these questions. The disingenuousness or the disservice that was done to this particular forum with regards to what happened on Monday resulted in a shortage in having to completely now deal with these matters, because departmental officials for land reform and rural development were invited and present to speak to the policy of land reform as Amakosi are curious. It's becoming quite clear that the department doesn't have a vision with regards to what land reform must look like in this country. What we are saying is KZN and Ingonyama Trust is a model that reflects land reform. And we are ready to stand up and take this model and allowed it to be extrapolated. But what we do need is time to make sure that we deal with the bugs in the model so that we don't export a model that is failing. Amakosi also expressed that they feel that their powers need to be codified. And we expressed our view that Amakosi's powers are quite clear where they go and where they stop. The challenge that Amakosi are facing is the government is failing them in the sense that the very writers of the laws end up having to capacitate Amakosi in these very laws, which creates a conflict. Therefore, that too we took, and we're going to take it to the necessary Izinkundla to go talk about it so that Amakosi can get the necessary capacity to deal and to apply and execute their powers as they have been codified. There are other issues around the turnover of rights. We're going to set rules that are going to be standardized, that are going to deal with those. We've spoken to tools of trade, and we've spoken to ways of how we need to think about resources, about where we get those resources, and about how we use those resources. That conversation was had, and it too reflects the failures of the Department of Cooperative Governance. Amakosi are complaining that they don't have tribal courts. Amakosi are complaining that they don't have infrastructure for information, technology, and communication. Amakosi are complaining that they don't have technology or information that allows them to survey and get a full understanding of that information. And we're quite resolute that those tools of trades are going to have to be brought. We'll find mechanisms. If government, again, is not coming to the party, ours at administrative level is to find ways of how we make this happen. We have proposed to Amakosi a couple of mechanisms that we could employ to this effect. We also discussed and dealt with the issue of Amakosi who are landless. The board has a strategy which it has presented to Amakosi, and we will be taking those views that Amakosi gave us in commissions and in the plenary and advisement so as to determine the land policy. We have looked at land claims under restitution. We've looked at land claims under various circumstances, and we are also quite resolute that we will have to deal with that. We looked at the workings between intergovernmental or between governmental entities, departments, and other organs of states, because Ingonyama Trust is an organ of state. And we spoke extensively about what role Amakosi must play. We're quite clear that Amakosi for a long time did not understand these things. They did not understand these frameworks, but Amakosi are now clear that they are going to take on the responsibility of getting the necessary understanding. Ingonyama Trust is going to be standing on the side of Amakosi to bring that knowledge. We too might not be competent on some of the things that are dealt with in these areas, but we know the people that are competent in those areas, and we will bring those people closer to assist Amakosi with technical know-how. We spoke about how Amakosi's level of participation during consultations on issues of IDPs, during participations in councils of imkhandlu yomasipala are quite important and central because they give us a voice. But more than that, they give us information that allows us to talk about reform and come up with strategies of how to implement that reform. There are various boundary issues that we're going to have to deal with. The sad thing is when Umzimkhulu was proclaimed into KwaZulu-Natal, there's a close to 500-page report that we had to consider as part of this engagement, the Strategic Engagement Forum, that had recommendations from the team that wrote that said, look into these issues of boundaries holistically and in an honest and historical research-based method so that there isn't inward disputes with regards to the resolution of these things. The recommendation of the report said start government. In fact, it was a cabinet proposition that became a cabinet resolution that said start government of KwaZulu-Natal and start dealing with these issues, given that you have the largest contingency of Amakosi, and therefore what you are likely to do is likely to set the standard for what must happen within the rest of the country. It's only now that Amakosi are quite clear about the fact that they are going to have to forerun this work. And so they're quite eager to take on the baton and actually do this work that's quite important. We spoke about Section 81 and the fact that Amakosi have to go back into council and implement Section 81. Amakosi asked us to see Section 81 in numbers and give them so they can go home and read and call us to ask questions and call our legal experts to ask questions and members of the board who know what to do with regards to these things so that Ngonyama Trust stands as advisors to Amakosi as it was intended when it comes to matters of land administration. The Finance Commission, which quite greatly excited me, looked into various issues of how we can utilize monies that come into Ngonyama Trust and ultimately go back into Izizwe for development purposes. We discussed and understood that there are various levels at which we can use money. And we understood that we have just been using money for consumption, and now we need to change our ways of thinking. So the ways in which we request money and the basis at which we request money must always be tied to the work that we are doing so we can justify how we are resolving these problems. Everyone will recall that Ngonyama Trust is based on beneficiaries. And therefore, we must be quite clear about what beneficiaries stand to gain from Ngonyama Trust. The past 3 decades have not factored that in this work. We are only doing it now. So it becomes quite important for all of us to band together and do this work. In closing, it is quite important that we differentiate between the political landscape of KwaZulu-Natal, which to an extent is now starting to draw in Amakosi, which has an impact of politicizing Amakosi. We have issued a warning to Amakosi and Lunkulu that is a risk, because ours is to assess risk and speak to mitigation. That is a risk that will see the diminishing of the institution of traditional leadership. We've expressed Amakosi Wuti ours in the act is to benefit Izizwe. It is important for us to then understand the various steps imigudu that we need to follow, which means if the process is lula enkosini, we too will pass there. However, we are clear who our beneficiaries are, and that is who we are working for. The reason we are doing this in this way is because we want a coherent way of working that is chosen by our people. Amakosi, as it stands, are a model that our people agreed to over 600 years ago. It is frozen in time and is stuck. We need to take it and move on and create what is ours from the disruptions that were created. We are unable to do that if we don't understand ourselves, if we don't understand what we have, and if we don't understand our systems. So it becomes important now that we also understand that Ngonyama Trust is at the juncture or at the crossroads of both Roman Dutch law and Zulu customary law. So these things are important for Amakosi to understand because they start touching on our ways of working and their legitimization. Customary law in South Africa is part of the constitutional framework. Therefore, its application is equivalent to Roman Dutch law, and it is applied when it is called on to be applied, even by the courts, the higher courts in South Africa. Therefore, all that is required here is knowledge. And we are bringing that knowledge, and that's what the disruption is. Amakosi asendlunkulu nemkhandlo yawo akufanele alazi iqiniso ngokuthi amandla awo okuphatha umhlaba nezizwe ahamba afikephi. Ours is to make sure that that happens, and we are resolute that we will stick on that path until the time comes where we are no longer in these chairs. Thank you very much.